Hi everyone, welcome to today's podcast. In this specific session, we're continuing our technical series, and in this specific session, we are talking about SU24 variants. So you might recall in the previous session, we made mention of authorization defaults. So in this session, Ross will practically show us how to make use of your SU24 variants to make use of those authorization default values when building your roles. So Ross, over to you. And thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you very much, Emil, and good day, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. What I'll do is just share my SAP session with us. I believe I am currently sharing. All right, so what we're focusing on today is more the technical side of what we've been discussing recently and as part of our technical series. So kind of talking about the fundamentals of authorizations and how we set up our role designs according to best practice to really focus on alleviating maintenance burdens and kind of improving on our overall authorization management efficiencies. So as such, SAP has provided us with a number of different tools and kind of methodologies in order to achieve this. And I think primarily the foundation of all of this comes down to what we refer to as authorization defaults, or what will be familiar to many of our technical resources on the call being SU24 fixes, as we'd call them, or your USOBT and USOBT_C tables. So we've discussed what an authorization default is. It's essentially authorizations that are tied to certain SAP applications, whether those are transaction codes, Fiori services, and within these defaults, we basically confirm whether or not the underlying SAP program behind that application makes reference or does an authority check against certain authorization objects, fields, and field values whenever certain scenarios are executed within the SAP program. So for today's example, I first just want to go into a kind of very common scenario or commonly used transaction code across many organizations, being the one responsible for performing of goods movements. So that would be transaction MIGO or MIGO, where we can perform certain functions or perform all manners of goods movements, whether that's performing of goods receipts for purchase orders or performing of goods issues, either internally within the organization or externally, for deliveries or against certain document types. As such, the transaction code has a very wide range of functionality, and in many organizations or many business scenarios, not all of that functionality is going to apply to a single user within the environment. So we've got certain users that may be responsible for performing goods receipts and certain users that are responsible for performing goods issues. And that is the example that I want to stick with today. So keeping that in mind, let's first just get an overview or understanding of exactly what an SU24 profile looks like, or the detail of an SU24 looks like for a transaction code like MIGO. So what we'll see here is all of the authorization objects that are linked or tied to the underlying program behind transaction code MIGO. So these are all of our auth objects. All right. Plenty within here, and we could spend an entire day going through each and every one. But for the demonstration's purpose, I'm just going to focus on kind of the core functionality of the MIGO transaction code being goods movements. So as such, we'll focus on our authorization objects that are related to goods movements. So what we have here is a certain list of authorization objects that are checked by the underlying SAP program under certain conditions. And the default indicator here letting us know that whenever we add this transaction code to a role, it is going to pull whatever we've populated for this transaction code into that role. It's just for ease of maintenance. So if we look at the list of objects here and consider how time consuming it would be that every time we add transaction MIGO to a authorization or an SAP single role, if we had to manually populate all of these objects and the values alongside that addition, it's going to be very time consuming. The chance for error is going to be quite high. And then that just turns around in delays to business processing when we are trying to get that to end users to enable them to perform certain functions. SU24 is here to help us set up those defaults beforehand. So as we add those transaction codes to any roles, that they are brought through automatically. We don't need to worry about manually adding all of these. And thankfully, SAP provides us a standard set of these authorization defaults and checks for our transaction codes. However, it is customizable in transaction SU24. All right, so moving on from the premise of SU24 fixes, we will revisit this shortly, but let's maybe paint ourselves a bit of a scenario using transaction MIGO. So first things first, we would like to create a specific role. There's a requirement from business that requires us to add MIGO to the authorizations of our end users. And the specific use of MIGO in this case would be to process of goods receipts or perform goods receipt processing. As such, I've got a standard naming convention here indicating that this is a task role within our module, and that is performing of goods receipts and processing. So, of course, any role design should have a good naming convention that kind of clearly indicates the contents of that role. By creating the role here in SAP, I now have my role or my container for my underlying SAP transaction codes. Typically, we would give that a standard or a short description that would align with our role name, right? And so once you're happy with our role description, the role menu is where we populate any SAP applications that need to exist within this role, or what the SAP applications this role needs to provide access to. As such, how we will typically do that is create a menu subfolder. So this is the menu that the user will interact with when they log on via their SAP GUI. They will let's create something that is more logical for them to access their transaction codes through. I'm going to add transaction MIGO to our role menu, right? So goods movement, transaction MIGO has been added, right? By saving that, we'll then navigate to the authorizations tab. So this is where the SU24 comes into play. First things first, whenever we're creating a role, I will generate a new profile for that role, right? Save that, and we enter the role design, the role itself to populate the underlying authorizations. Right, so coming into the role, first draw our attention to all of the content of the authorization content that's being pulled through. As I said, it's all standard, it's all automatic, it's all based on what is populated here in SU24. So all of these values that we're seeing here are automatically brought into the role design by the SAP authorization concept. When we make a change to the role menu, SAP will conduct a check of what has been added to that menu, what are the authorization defaults tied to that item, and then populate those in the roles. First thing that we see when we enter the authorizations is a requirement to define certain org levels in our role itself. So there's a difference between certain fields in that we've got organizational level fields. These are fields that will typically adhere to your enterprise structure or relate to your enterprise structure that is set up within your environment. So fields within authorization objects that control on kind of where or how a user is able to use those authorizations. As such, in this example here, we're looking at the org fields of shipping point and plant. So for this example, typically, if we were saying we're creating this role specifically for plant 1000, we could populate those specific values there so that the users are only able to work within that area of the organization and not within, for example, plant 2000. For this example, I'm just going to kind of leave everything as star because that's not the focus of this particular example. But after populating our org levels, we'll hopefully expect to see standard clean authorization design where every field has some sort of value populated. However, we do see here that there is an open authorization, a value that's not been maintained as per best practice. We want to make sure that that is updated. Right, so we have a certain object here. It's the standard authorization object for performing of goods movements and determining what movement type is available within that authorization object, or from this role, what movement type does this role authorize users to perform. So as standard, we've got activities. So you'll see this field, ACTVT, appear across many different authorization objects. A lot of our technical administrators will be familiar with that. And as I think most common knowledge in SAP, that your activity values 01, 02, 03 are probably the most standard, the most kind of uniform values that we'll see throughout our SAP authorization concept. 01 for creating of something, some sort of data subject, 02 being changing of that subject, and 03 being displaying or display rights of whatever this authorization object is adhering to. So this is, of course, referring to goods movements. Our role is being built with the purpose of enabling our users to perform goods receipts. As such, we want to make sure that the goods, the movement type field over here is populated with the appropriate values as to not provide users with access to perform anything other or outside of the role's intended purpose. So if we're wanting users to be able to create, process, change, or display goods receipts or goods receipt movements, we would typically want to populate that with our standard goods receipt movement types. So being able to perform a goods receipt for a purchase order and being able to do the reversal of that goods receipt if required. We can then populate that manually within a provided authorization. However, best practice, as we at Centurion like to encourage all of our listeners and clients to make use of, we'll notice that this now becomes a maintained field. And as such, this authorization is no longer standard. It's no longer adhering to that automated authorization default concept that we've seen in our SU24. So if we were to create another role where goods receipts, for example, is part of the function of MIGO within that role, we will need to repeat this maintenance function. We'll get the blank field coming up again. We'll need to repeat that addition of those movement types any number of times that transaction with goods receipt processing is required in any role. As such, what is available to us is to be able to maintain that SU24 default so that every time we do add this transaction code, we are ensuring that these values are populated. So, for a single field to maintain that, that might not sound as maintenance heavy as it could be, but in many scenarios, you have many different empty fields, as we saw earlier. So when you've got 10, 20 empty fields that need to be manually maintained every time you add that transaction code to a role, I think it becomes a lot more clearer. There's a lot more sense to maintain those once in some form of SU24 fix to make sure that those are always accounted for whenever we are maintaining the role. So what I'll do here is just delete our two line items, right? Reset this to the blank field as it was, where we have our standard instance. And I want to show you that how making an SU24 fix is going to adhere or apply our how it will behave within the role. All right. So before I move over to the SU24 change, because there's a scenario that I want to kind of bring up here that might influence how we work within SU24. What I want to do is first refer to maybe a secondary scenario that's come up within the organization. Not only do they require a role with MIGO that provides users with access to process goods receipts, but there's also a requirement for users to get access to MIGO to process goods issues. There's a segregation here that we want certain users to only be able to perform goods receipts with that role, and certain users that only need to perform goods issues. So another feature of VFCG would be the role copy function, right? So we've got our goods receipt processing. As we said, there's a requirement from the organization to also include goods issue processing, right? So we're going to copy our receipt role over to issue, because we know that it requires the same content, the same transaction code of MIGO. It's the underlying authorizations that will determine the actual function that can be executed within this transaction code. As such, we've now created our goods issue processing role. All right, I'll do the subsequent change to our role description. Save that. All right, and let me update our role menu function by changing the folder name. Okay. Perfect. All right, we're going to save that. We'll go into the role content. By copying our role over, we'll see we're presented with the same role content as we had with our goods receipts. But through this, what I want to highlight is now there's a requirement to have the same transaction, that's dealing with the same authorization defaults across two different roles that are both built with a separate purpose in mind, right? So how do we address the challenge of populating different field values as per the authorization default concept within SAP? That can be achieved through something that they call SU24 variants. However, first things first is, of course, if we wanted to try and achieve that with just the standard MIGO SU24, if we're going to try populate our movement types for goods or receipts within here, yes, we can save that. And when we come into the role again, we will see our SU24 or movement types 101 and 102. That's going to appear in both our goods receipt and goods issue. And of course, that's going to present us with the challenge of not having intended values in either role. So in order to address that, I'm going to use the variant concept of SU24s. So in our SU24 screen here, we've got transaction MIGO. We want to create a variant of MIGO by selecting that button there. And let's do a Z MIGO GR. We want to create it in the custom namespace as indicated by a Z as a prefix for any SAP related data dictionary objects, right? And we're going to say goods receipts processing. All right, I'm going to save that. Whenever we're creating an SU24 default, we need a default variant. We need to assign that to an appropriate SAP package. Using our Saturn package here as an example, data dictionary objects will be assigned to this package. And of course, we need to assign that to a relevant transport. So we'll assign that to the appropriate workbench request. And as you'll see here, we now have a variant of MIGO. While we're in the SU24 screen, I'm going to create our secondary variant. So we've obviously got one for goods receipts. We also want to create one for goods issues. All right, so we'll call that MIGO GI, and that's issue processing. All right. I'll save that again to the same package. We'll assign it to the same. We'll create a workbench request for that. Saturn. If there's an existing workbench request, go ahead and assign it to that, which will create one here. All right. We've got our workbench request that we've assigned this to, and we'll see here we've got our two variants that are set up for us. So within our MIGO goods issue processing variant, I now have the ability to find my blank fields here, and I'm going to populate our relevant movement types. So for this example, I'm going to use a common movement type for goods issues of 201 and 202, which is goods issues out of a cost center or to a cost center for stock consumption. All right, I'll save that appropriately. I'm then going to go into our goods receipt processing variant, where we'll see those values of 201 and 202 for the goods receipt movement types have not been saved there. I'll now save it as a 101 and a 102 for the goods receipt to purchase order and reversal of such in our goods receipt variant. And I will save that. Now we know that these values are available. They are populated within the authorizations underlying those SFE transaction codes. Let me head out of our roles. Let's maybe start with our first things first. Let's refresh PFCG. Let's go into goods receipt, our goods receipt processing role, where we'll now see that yes, we do have transaction MIGO within the role menu. However, under the applications tab, we can now see that our variants or our authorization default variants are available for us to select to determine what authorization defaults we want to pull through to the authorization content of the role. So I'm going to deactivate MIGO and I'm going to activate our MIGO GR variant. Right. I'm going to hit enter on that. I'll save my selection for that, or Control S. I'll go to our authorizations view. I will hit expert mode. All right. So whenever we're in an existing role and we've made a change to an SU24 fix, we want to make use of the expert mode for profile generations, and we want to read the old status of the role authorizations and merge that with any new data that we have since populated within SU24. By executing that, we'll see that now that yellow triangle indicating an empty authorization field has since been removed or replaced. We now have our goods receipt movement types populated within this instance of our authorization object that controls goods movements, or the movements types that we allow to execute for goods movements. I can then save, generate that role, and transport that role through to whatever system that is needed to be tested in. Let's take a look at our goods issue processing role. Similarly, by coming into this role, we see MIGO within that role. Within the applications view, I want to select my MIGO goods issue variant. Right. I want to change our authorizations. I think saving that, it does force the change mode. And we now see our goods issue movement types within the authorization instance for our goods movement type controlling object. Saving that. And maybe before I do that, before I get out of it, what we notice here is that everything is standard. Everything is automatically brought in by maintaining those authorization defaults. So there's no manually maintained instances of objects in here, meaning that every time this goods issue or goods receipt function is required across any different role, if we're working with a job role methodology, and this is going to be required across many different roles, setting it up in this way takes us 5-10 minutes to set it up in the environment. But every time that is required moving forward, we know that the appropriate authorizations are going to be pulled through automatically. It's not a maintenance activity that we need to keep in mind to manually populate specific values or specific objects as and when we require them. It's always something that is pre-configured and automatically brought into the role. So with that, I hope that showcases the use and value of the authorization default variants through transaction SU24. Thank you for joining us in this example, and we hope to see you in the next one.
Thank you very much, Ross. Take care, everyone. Until the next time. Bye.